بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I was giving some thought to a popular assumption we may have when it comes to the field of religion. And I think that would be the notion of universalism or universality. And it is very tempting and can feel very forthright to think of one's religion as being universal. And indeed, there is obviously an aspect of Islam that is universal. One does not have to belong to a particular tribe or have a particular ethnicity or lineage to be a part of it. You don't have to be from a special class in society. But there's another side to universality, I think, particularly as it relates to the Muslim in modern times and the so-called nation state. That is worth taking a second glance at that arrangement, our stance towards it, and that it's typically thought of that religions, or at least religion, like revealed religions such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, to a lesser or greater extent, have a proselytizing aspect to them. They call people to their way. We are familiar with our own tradition of what we call da'wah, right? To call people to Islam, to Tawheed, to monotheism, to the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the one thing I wanted us to think about in terms of another side to a religion that is thought of in universal terms is, can that, on occasion, can that impulse to be universal, can it be hijacked and actually employed against you as a particular adherent to that religion? Can it be turned against you? And we saw in this recent election that apparently still isn't over yet, we've seen people aligning with various parties, predominantly when it came to American Muslims, aligning with the Democratic Party. But this is not something new just for this election alone. We've actually seen this tendency of moving towards the left over the last decade or so for Muslims, actually, getting close to really 2 decades now, particularly since 9/11, whereas before that there was maybe, if from a social point of view, certainly liberalist leanings, but firmly grounded in morally conservative stances. We've seen walking away from that. And, while it's one thing to think of one's religion as being universal, right? And that's a wonderful thing, right? But given how the West has essentially in one form or another now for the past, well, maybe not quite a full century, but certainly since the Cold War, has been on a proselytizing mission of its own to bring its beliefs to the rest of the world. And there has been a curious marriage already between the state power and various forms of Christianity, particularly in its evangelical form, but which also seems to be lost on the evangelicals, is a betrayal often of their Christian sensibilities, at which, in order to maintain power or to have the illusion of having proximity to it, there has had to take place a great betrayal of Christian values. And we very much see the same carrot being dangled in front of American Muslims, in which increasingly it seems that the Muslim identity now is being subsumed under the proselytizing mission of Western democracy, perhaps even more particular in its American form than in its European form, under the guise of such things as diversity and tolerance, that Muslims are now being folded into and subsumed into the West, but at a great cost and a great price. And that the allure is that this will provide us some kind of happy home or happy space for us to occupy. But by the time this proselytizing mission is done, there may be very little left of the Muslim that is still recognizably Muslim. And that's why I asked the question, is it, or is there not then a kind of advantage in adhering to more a form of particularism? A particularism in which anybody is free to join you. So whoever wants to become Muslim can join the Muslims. But we are not free to simply join them lock, stock, and barrel. Again, in the current tide, right? In the current tide, Muslims are being drowned under in my opinion, a deluge of elusive ideals of inclusion that will ultimately have to come at the price of Islam itself. And I believe that many Muslims now today really balk at the idea of Islam being a religion that claims a exclusivist salvation. That seems to trouble many Muslims, let alone other people. Perhaps this is why now we see, along with kind of modernist and want-to-be or pretenders to the throne of Islamic Reformation imams and scholars, comes the perennialist in disguise Christian figures, non-Muslim perennialist figures that want to teach us our religion. So they will no longer just simply be there as guests at various interfaith gatherings, but now will be there at actually intra-faith gatherings. They will be there at the Mawlid, even though I'm not a person that actually agrees on the permissibility. I do not agree on the permissibility of the Mawlid, and therefore I don't do it. But that aside, it's interesting that now on what would be intra-Muslim things that non-Muslims are invited to all in the spirit of universality. and that it would seem to be that the one of the ways in which a person can negotiate their reality today and still kind of fend off the state and the predatory aspect of the nation state is to remain semi aloof of politics. And I say semi because I'm not saying that we should be politically agnostic. No, I believe we can have a political voice. But the real question is, are we doing it because there's some particular things we want from the state? And are we getting them? Or have we been sold a bill of goods and a kind of ideal, and we were hoping for some kind of safe space or something that can only be granted by capitulating to it? And I think this election has shown this in more relief, right, and greater contrast than the election before it. And therefore, our conversations about, Republican or Democrat or Trump versus Biden have to go beyond the cults of personality that is what tends to dominate a lot of popular politics. I still feel that Muslims have not really come to a point where they can comfortably say, I want A, B, and C, and E, F, G, and W, X, Y, Z out of America. I want these things. And I will work within a certain latitude to achieve those. But in terms of just jumping into the fray and becoming part of the whole, whether that whole be Democratic or Republican, I believe not only would be a tragic mistake, and I say not only would be because in fact it's happening. So we are in the midst of a very tragic mistake to wed ourselves these things versus what do we want? I hear a lot of talk about religious freedom, mainly coming from the right. Ironically, I don't hear a lot of it coming from those Muslims that would vote for Joe Biden. They seem to see that maybe the Democrats in 2000 or 2008 or 2016 or 2020 maybe taking a stance on a particular moral issue of which the Republicans, the GOP, or Trump is not. And that's a fair assessment. But the question is, why are we leaving it up exclusively to a party to represent our morality versus we stand upon these things and we are trying to create long-term principles by which we operate, not only, well, what flies in 2016 and what flies in 2020 and what might fly in 2024. That's what bothers me the most, and that's what makes me somewhat reluctant to really buy into, let's just take the issue of like Black Lives Matter. I find this newfound vigor for the concern about Black life amongst Muslims to be somewhat questionable, and I know that's not a popular notion. And obviously I'm basing that not only on the previous 60, 70 year track record of American Muslims that by and large have not only seemed to care about the lives of black folks, they've seemed to care about pretty much the other or the opposite of the lives of black folks. And that's fine because, to be quite honest, as a black person, I don't really expect for or demand that others care about me. So I find this newfound vigor for that a little bit questionable. And then when I start to examine, well, do you even understand what it is that black people want? Because one of the problems that we have in black America, we have not articulated what we even want from America. So it's kind of a blind leading the blind situation where suddenly Black Lives Matter has become a great, talking point, hashtag. I mean, you even see young Muslim kids, wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts. But do you even really know any black people? Do you even know what matters to us? Do you know what it is that we want from society? Versus picking up somebody else's placard and shaking it and championing this thing now, but you still don't even actually know what I really need. Ironically, and I will say this not only as an African American, but as an African American Muslim and as an African American imam, what black people need is Islam. And what I find is that in our jargon and sloganisms about Black Lives Matter coming from the Muslim community is a very secular one. What black people really need is Islam. What black folks need is a complete disentanglement from shirk, from the psychologies of associating partners with God. We need a way of looking at the universe and having a whole new epistemology, a whole new way of looking completely at the world that is not just simply detached from white supremacy, but detached from shirk. Because, we can free ourselves from white supremacy today. It does not mean that we will be free of looking at the world through a polytheist lens. So this is what concerns me about the headlong dive into a pool that has no water of championing Black Lives Matter, ironically as a Muslim, of which there is no conversation about, oh, Black America, we have seen your plight, and we have seen your dehumanization, and we have seen your dignity stripped from you, and we have seen the violence visited upon you, and we have seen and witnessed the oppression. We may have even been tacitly complicit in the last several decades that we've been in this country, but we understand now. And what we see is not only that you need to have you don't need a generic form of justice. You need divine justice. And that will only come about with Islam. And yet, those Muslims that are carrying with them a possible solution for people's problems is never even offered as a solution. And yet, we're going to give you democracy and freedom of speech and, feminism and liberalism and every other ism under the sun. Versus, this is a way to detach yourself from systems of oppression. This is a way to empower yourself, to do for self. No. And so that's why I'm very skeptical still. And, whoever wins this election, I'm still very skeptical, whether it's Trump or Biden. I'm very skeptical, to be quite honest, about the efficacy of any of those systems to do anything for those who really need things done for them. Black folks just being one example. So we have to maybe rethink this idea of universality, because in the current age that we live in, universality has been usurped by the nation state. And that's why it wants to now go around the rest of the world and spread its message. It wants to proselytize. And we've actually seen this happen now, whether it's from the left or even from the so-called right, the neocons, who in my opinion are really more like liberals in a wolves in sheep's clothing kind of thing. They want to go and spread this around the world, and now you will find both left and right chastising Muslim countries because they have not swung the barn doors wide open to the alphabet soup nonsense of trans this and LGBT that and so on. It's no longer just a liberal thing. It's now become part of, essentially everything in the West now has become liberal. Whether that is the neocon liberal or the liberal, it's all essentially been hijacked. And so we're in some ways one of the last few groups that has something truthfully outside the system to offer. And yet we are increasingly hypnotized and memorized and hoodwinked and bamboozled to not even think to look into this thing that we already have called Islam. No, let's look to every other solution under the sun. So maybe we should rethink this idea of universalism. Not that we don't want to have universal appeal, but like with many things, at what cost and what price? Anyway, a last thought before bed. Inshallah, maybe you will see this tomorrow on Friday. It's about 10 o'clock on Thursday night. And inshallah, I tend to maybe upload this in the morning. Maybe you'll see this inshallah on Friday. So something to think about. Maybe we can do a online Q&A roundtable discussion. Would love to get some of your thoughts on it. Assalamu alaikum.